Hello again. My name is Hassan Santur. I am the co-host of Shaah with the European Union. This is a vlog in which we talk to senior EU personnel as well as EU implementing partners in Somalia to discuss their work in the country. Today, we are happy to have Andrew Lanyon. He is a resilience and social protection coordinator in Somalia with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. We thought it would be a good idea to speak with Andrew today because, as you know, June 5th is World Environment Day, and Somalia is one of the countries that is really hard hit by a myriad of environmental challenges, including drought, floods, and deforestation. And all these environmental challenges and degradations, of course, have a huge impact on the country's agricultural development and agricultural output, which in turn has a huge impact on the livelihoods of millions of Somalis. So we thought it would be a really great day to speak with Andrew. Hi, Andrew. Since today is World Environment Day, can you tell us a little about some of the pressing environmental issues that FAO is grappling with in Somalia, especially as this relates to agricultural productivity in the country?
Well, Somalia is a country with, unfortunately, with its more than its fair share of environmental stress and shock. And this is only being further exacerbated by climate volatility. So in particular, what we're seeing is a cycle of drought and flood that alternates. And in addition to that, we're also seeing other factors or other elements that come in, such as desert locust, which is a result of flood, effectively, which creates an excess of animal or feed fodder for the insects, and that results in plagues that then strip the productivity out of the agricultural system by eating all the crops. So Somalia has got a lot of challenges. It's either going from a drought, then into a flood, and into an insect plague. And it seems now that the crisis year is becoming the normal year, as opposed to the normal year being a productive year.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And tell us a little about some of the projects that FAO is in partnership with the EU is currently working on in Somalia, so that some of these disturbances and environmental issues that you talk about don't end up resulting in humanitarian crisis such as famines.
So I'm very happy to be working in partnership with the EU and also the Somali government with the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Livestock, and also Ministry of Fisheries. And the EU works closely with all of those ministries with FAO as an implementing partner to deliver programming that is supportive of the government meeting its responsibilities to the Somali people. And that can take many forms. It really depends on the sector. So the EU is working with FAO and the government, or the Ministry of Agriculture, in irrigation and rehabilitating extensive irrigation schemes that used to be operational pre-war, and this is in the 90s, pre-90s. And these irrigation systems in the pre-war environment were able to sustain the food security requirements of the whole country. Which it hasn't been able to do since the war as a result of long-term degradation of the infrastructure. So getting the water back to these river communities so that they can produce crops and produce crops with irrigation actually effectively doubles the yield of that land. And these irrigation systems are extensive, as I said. We've only just started in the last year with the EU and the government working on these. Prior to that, there was a lot of emphasis on short-term interventions, but this is much more developmental. In addition to that, we work with the EU on providing livestock water sources. And these are really critical. A large section of the Somali population depends upon animal export, and having water access, especially during dry season, is absolutely critical. In addition to that, working with fodder as well, or rangeland. Pasture access is also really, really critical as well. So protecting pasture so it's available in times, dry seasons and in drought. And then also ensuring that fodder is harvested when it's wet season, and that is stored so that it can be used for animals during dry season. And these are all critical parts of the providing climate resilience. So when climate is volatile, that communities are able to withstand those shocks. We're also working in the fisheries sector, and that sector is critically important for Somalia because of its huge potential, but also because of the current vulnerability to exploitation, unregulated exploitation. So we're working with the fisheries sector in helping the government regulate their coastline with fishing licenses and helping artisans, small-scale fisheries scale up so that they can actually take advantage of the significant coastal resources that they've got. And there's huge potential for expansion of fisheries, but it is under threat because there is a lot of effectively illegal fishing going on from outside of Somalia coming in from other parts of the world because of the huge productive capacity of the coastal resources. So the EU is working across all of those productive sectors with FAO, and I'm really encouraged by the donorship of the EU to work in partnership in these areas.
So just before I move on to my other questions, there's a couple of things I want to follow up. One is you just spoke about partnership, and I think it's a really important word in the context of Somalia, because the challenges are so many and so big that it takes a partnership, not just with the EU, but with so many other both international and national NGOs. Can you talk a little bit about some of the sort of the benefits of having these kinds of partnerships and relationships in Somalia in context, especially?
Right. So, I mean, partnership is not a new thing for this industry, the international development industry. But it's important, I guess, that we stick to that principle as being foundational. In Somalia, in particular, what we find is there is the climate change and the climate risks that are presented to the smallholder farmers, the small-scale fishing, the herders, and to the government ministries are complex. They're very difficult, and complex problems require collaboration. They require collaboration across government, private sector, donors, and technical expertise. And between the beneficiary communities that we work with, the private sector, the ministry, the donor, and FAO, we have the full required capacity to be able to address the complex problems. But we really do need to collaborate on our respective aspects of the project. So what we do when we do these projects with the government and the EU and the community is we start with analysis, trying to understand what is the system, what's driving the volatility, what's driving the vulnerability, and where are the opportunities as well. And then once we understand the system, we can talk with the different stakeholders in that production system, agriculture, livestock, or fisheries, so that we can address different aspects. Is it actually farmers being helped with production systems, and what's the role of government in providing support in that, or the role in the private sector in providing high quality inputs like seeds and fertilizers and tools, or is it more a regulatory framework issue? And then working with the private sector to actually be able to sell that production into markets that actually have high potential for profit. And then also the EU itself is helping out with policy initiatives and also access to those markets too, as well as we want to make sure that Somali producers have the ability to be able to produce agriculture products livestock products and fishes products that actually meet international standards, and that those standards are mandated, and that we're actually able to access high value markets, including those in Europe. And having the policy and standard frameworks in place really makes that opportunity possible, which is not possible before without all those actors working together. And then finally, of course, having a donor that is willing to finance these activities it's the grease in the machine. It's actually the resources required to make all these things work together, which is where the EU plays obviously the big role in terms of investment.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. Without the finance and these funds, nothing really is possible. All these amazing things that you mentioned will not be done, at least to the level that they can be done without these funds. Okay, excellent. So I just want to, for my own understanding, and I'm sure a lot of other people would like to know this, and I don't know if you guys have actual concrete numbers for this, but what percentage of Somali's population relies on the agriculture sector for their livelihood, and what are some of the ways that organizations such as yours are trying to improve the country's agricultural development?
Well, FAO does a lot of technical studies, as you'd imagine, being a technical UN agency. And a recent study that we did with the government and the World Bank found that 70% of the population of Somalia depends upon agriculture or livestock as their primary source of production and income, which is an extraordinary number of people. And in addition to that, 49% of those people are actually rurally based, as opposed to urban based. So it's at least half and up to 2/3 of the population are dependent upon productive sectors for their livelihood and their food security. And this is why it's so critically important for the work of FAO with the EU and the Ministries of Agriculture and Fisheries and Livestock to keep working on the various aspects of production and markets and access to those markets, and also the management and institutional capacity to manage markets and production, because it affects up to 70% of the population in their day-to-day life and their ability to feed themselves, their family, to be able to make enough living to be able to afford basic services, and to be able to develop as a nation as well. And the kind of the work that we're doing with the EU, as I was saying before, is we have fairly significant projects with the EU and the Ministry of Agriculture in terms of irrigation and rebuilding what was a very productive and successful riverine agriculture sector that was able to produce, pre-war conditions, able to produce enough food to actually feed the whole country. And due to decades of neglect and war, it's fallen into disrepair and needs to be addressed. And an interesting side effect of addressing that irrigation capacity is also that it reduces the risk of flood, because water that's being diverted for irrigation is not water that's actually flooding into towns and villages and schools and hospitals. Or into productive farmland uncontrolled and destroying production. It's actually being channeled and diverted for production. And water is an amazing resource, but it's also a possible threat given flood years, as we've seen just recently in Balatwain and also last year in Balatwain. So there's huge potential in scaling up the work that the EU is doing with irrigation. And the restoration of irrigation capacity, not only for production, but also for flood risk reduction. In the livestock sector, I mentioned before, water, strategic resources. Livestock migrates out of Somalia to the north, into the Gulf of Aden and to the Gulf states, and then also across to the east and the south into livestock markets in Eastern Africa. And all of those trade routes, there are strategic gaps in water supply. There are also strategic gaps in fodder availability. So animals that are on the hoof on the way to market lose their body condition, or in some cases die. because they don't have access to food and water. And the EU is working with us in the Ministry of Livestock on addressing those issues. In addition to that, in the fisheries sector, as I was saying, there's a huge potential for expansion in fisheries because of the resources that are available, and it's a sleeping giant in Somalia. It really is, and can be much more developed and developed in a sustainable way that actually protects it for future growth, food security, livelihoods, and also for next generations.
Absolutely. And I think that report that you were referring to, is that the one that was done with the World Bank, as you said, in 2018? I think it was called Rebuilding Resilience and Sustainable Agriculture in Somalia.
Correct, yeah.
And I did, one of the things as I was sort of reading it, one of the things that stuck out for me was that it said, over the past 3 decades, the livestock and crops subsectors have been buffeted by, and I'm quoting this now, have been buffeted by Somalia's increasingly fragile and degraded natural environment and more frequent and severe cycles of droughts and floods. End quote. So I just sort of emphasizing that point that you were making before, that what we're seeing now, some of the challenges have been sort of in the making for decades now.
Correct, and it's got to the point now with longer term trend analysis where effectively out of every 3 years, only 1 year is actually considered a normal production year. So the 2 other years are a crisis year, either a drought or a flood or an insect plague. All which are related back to climate volatility.
Absolutely. And I suppose what makes your job and the job of the work of organizations such as FAO is that, you know, this is essentially a technical sort of organization, and they're really in the weeds of things, and it's not the sexiest sort of most sort of headline grabbing work that you're doing, unless we're in the middle of, you know, a famine or, you know, a huge environmental issue or climate issues such as, you know, floods and droughts. So I suppose, I mean, this is not really a question; it's more of a I think a way of saying that the work that you do is so important, yet so often we don't hear about it because it's really the sort of everyday technical challenges that you're dealing with.
Right. I mean, FAO is a technical agency, so I mean there are a lot of technicians, a lot of PhDs, a lot of masters specialists and PhD specialists. But the reality of that expertise is that it provides high levels of support to the sectors and government in providing advice and recognizing that some of the challenges of these wicked problems that we face in agriculture and livestock and fisheries and climate change are going to be dealt with innovation and adaptation. And that requires a high level of technical expertise to think outside the box, to look at new ways of doing things, but also build things on the basis of evidence and strong analysis. We're not an agency that deals in short, sharp, soundbite interventions. So we're actually looking much more at the systemic vulnerabilities, but also the opportunities, and trying to find new ways of doing things that enable us to adapt to the new reality of climate volatility going forward. And that requires a lot of smart people. We have a lot of boffins in the basement.
Good. We need all those. And I think what you're saying is very true about sort of the dealing with the systemic issues and the long-term issues rather than, which is very important. I mean, when humanitarian crisis hits, of course, you want people, you know, boots on the ground, as they say, really saving lives in that, you know, immediate aftermath. But you will always get stuck in these long, you know, sort of these humanitarian crisis mode if you're not dealing with the long-term issues and underlying issues. And I think even though you talked about it, I think it's so important that it bears repeating that you are working on some long-term fixes to the problem, and one of them you mentioned was the, you know, building these or rehabilitating these I don't know what you call them, but if you can remind me some of the
canals. We were a lot of them are canals. We also have things called barrage walls, which are like effectively diversion walls that divert floodwater into canals.
Yeah.
And we're working on all of those things along the rivers. I mean, just to respond to your comment, I think it's important. We need to recognise that in a place like Somalia, where we do have chronic problems, but we have acute stress. Okay, so the chronic problem needs to be addressed longer term, which is the climate volatility, be it drought, flood, or other climate-based shocks, makes it extremely difficult for the country to develop and for individual households and communities to get out of a cycle of continual loss, a downward spiral of loss. And that's in a very insidious spiral, insofar as there's that losing one season of production can be survivable and can be rebuilt over time. But if you lose 3, 4, 5, or 6 in a series, or in that series of 6, only one is actually profitable out of the 5, then over time, the whole sector gets degraded. People's ability to feed themselves, people's ability to make money and save that and then spend that money on other things, be it healthcare, education, and then also what the inevitable consequence of this, unfortunately, and we're seeing this as a side effect of this long-term trend, is huge scale displacement, where farming and pastoral families are in a situation where they they basically sell all their assets. They sell their land holding, they sell what they've got left, because they can no longer make a viable living from this traditional livelihood, and then they become landless and penniless, and find themselves displacing into the city en masse. And every crisis, be it a flood or a drought, actually sees that influx into the urban areas of Somalia, where literally tens of thousands of people are migrating because they can no longer make a viable livelihood in their rural areas. And we're talking about, as I said before, 70% of the population depends upon rural livelihoods. So you really need to be able to work at those longer term issues. And I've mentioned things like restoring the capacity of irrigation, but also ensuring that there is access to water and pasture during dry season along the main trade routes. And also develop the potential of sectors like fisheries to employ people. People can actually transfer to different types of livelihoods. But at the same time, you can't turn a blind eye to the obvious humanitarian needs of the short-term displaced people, and also the people that want to stay and recover and continue in their livelihood. And I'm very, very happy to say that the EU is working with us and the government to ensure that all of those scales of intervention are addressed on an annual basis. And I think that's the solution. We can't just say you have to do humanitarian, or you have to do development, or you have to do recovery. You actually need to do all 3 at once to address the various levels of the system. And I think the EU is showing really good donorship by making that decision to work at all 3 levels, because you have to address all 3 in order to come up with a comprehensive solution for the most vulnerable households. It doesn't result in a quick impact. It's not something you see a change in 6 months or a year. It's 3-5-year investments. But over time, what you see is a gradual reduction in the vulnerability of those households and those communities, because you're providing them with longer-term solutions, reducing their risk to shocks, but at the same time, when a shock happens, remaining responsive to their acute short-term needs and helping them bounce back stronger and better.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, holistic approach that you just mentioned, as well as collaboration, and that's really the only way to get out of these really challenging times for the country. I've been speaking with Andrew Lanyon. He is a Resilience and Social Protection Coordinator in Somalia with the Food and Agriculture Organization at the United Nations. Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me and telling us about some of the projects that you're working on in Somalia.
Absolute pleasure. Anytime.
Excellent. All right. Have a nice day.
Bye.